welcome. Sorry for a little bit of a delay on the food, but we're just a couple of minutes behind time. The subject today is the impact on and response to impact of events in Xinjiang on the rest of Central Asia and their responses, both on the official and unofficial levels. The name Xinjiang, just to remind you, means, curiously, new region, which suggests that when that was applied to it, it was a new region. That this is not some ancient Chinese territory, and this is a story of modern history, therefore, not of ancient history. And the official name of the region, just to remind you, which you don't need to be reminded of, is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It has a four-word title, every one of them problematic. The first one I just spoke to, the second, Uyghur, it identifies a particular ethnicity as defining the region, and they were Turkic people were 99% in 1949, and then autonomous. And then region, not any other territorial unit, but region. This is on the Soviet model of autonomous regions. So every one of these has, in a sense, has been present with the founding of it and the PLAs coming through Xinjiang in 1949. And the issues that we're dealing with today, I suppose, could be simply defined as various peoples within that region seeking to implement what they consider to be the literal meaning of the name of the region. We're talking about the third largest group in Greater Central Asia, the Uyghurs, who are actually the second largest Turkic group, after only following the Uzbeks. There are more Uyghurs than there are Kazakhs, than there are Kyrgyz, than there are Turkmen, and only the Tajiks are more numerous if you combine the Tajiks in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan. So they are a major group within the region that is the focus of our study. And I should also say, I'm saying things that are obvious and that are known, I'm sure, to everyone in the room, but they were the first Turkic people to have their own written language. And Mahmud of Kashgar, an extraordinary figure who did a guide to the Turkic languages 1,000 years ago, and explained to the reader exactly what changes you have to make if you know one Turkic language in order to master the others. It's an extraordinary piece of ethnography, linguistics, the works. And along the way, he included in his work, and I don't know how it got there, what is the oldest today recognized as the oldest map of Japan anywhere. That was Mahmud of Kashgar, and another one who actually was born in the territory of Kyrgyzstan today, Yusuf of Balasagun. His picture is on the Turkish currency, and his great work was the introduction of the language as a medium of literature, and indeed of high literature. So we're talking about significant groups of people. We're talking about people with real history or with real past, identity, if you will. We're also talking about 1.5 million Kazakhs in Xinjiang, large percentage of whom fled there, as did the much smaller 1.5 million Kyrgyz population, fled there after the events of 1916, which has been the subject of a book that we've published, and many articles and so on that have been issued over the time. So this is the situation broadly. You know what's been going on there. I just want to take note, since a co-author is here, of the book, Xinjiang, China's Muslim Borderland, which we published now 15 years ago. It has been very widely read and used. It's translated twice into Chinese, and I have copies of both of the Chinese translations, which obviously it goes directly against the statement in Wikipedia that this book was widely criticized in China. It wasn't. The Chinese Foreign Ministry translated and published it. It's very widely read. It was the intelligence people who were scared of it and who took actions to prevent some of the authors from gaining visas for many years, which was uncalled for and unwarranted because the book doesn't pose any kind of a threat to anyone. And Sean Roberts was a distinguished author in that project. Well, here we are, and I'm really pleased to introduce this program. I'm going to begin with Sean Roberts, who's a cultural anthropologist, but he was very closely studying not just Xinjiang, but the Kyrgyz and Kazakh borders long before anyone else took an interest in that subject, and you can read about that in our book, Xinjiang, which you'll find under my name as editor. He's the Director of International Development Studies at the Elliott School at Georgetown, and retains his deep, George Washington, and retains his deep and well-informed interest in this region. Sir.
All right. I'm going to defer to the two speakers of Uyghur descent in terms of the background of what's happening. And I'll just focus purely on the response of Central Asia. So first of all, I think it's critical to understand that in Central Asia there's a long history of xenophobia. There is a lot of history of interaction between the Central Asian peoples and states based in China. And much of it's been characterized by conflict over the centuries. But I think, to the point that Dr. Starr brought up about ancient history, I think that's less important than the impact of the Sino-Soviet split. And the Sino-Soviet split in Central Asia, when I was there in the 90s, I noted that people were much more concerned about the threat of China than the threat of the US during the Cold War, during the late Cold War anyways, because China was much closer. And that has continued to be a characteristic in the region, the fear that China will overwhelm Central Asia. However, that's balanced with another attitude in the region, which is seeing great economic opportunity in China. So since 2000 in particular, the Central Asian states have been increasingly engaged economically with China. And a lot of people from the region have gone to China to study with the hopes of translating that into successful careers. China's had a lot of soft power in the region. So I think that's kind of the basis we're dealing with. And the question is, how does the situation in the Uyghur region of China right now impact those attitudes? I think there's 4 dimensions that are worthwhile looking at in terms of people's political attitudes towards the mass internment of Turkic people in China. The first is the pan-Turkic dimension. And for people who studied geopolitics at the fall of the Soviet Union, you'll be aware of this idea that pan-Turkism could be a strong force in Central Asia. With time, we found that is not the case. Central Asian people I think, they share a certain affinity along Turkic lines, but my experience studying Uyghurs in Central Asia is that for the other Central Asian people, they feel bad for the situation of the Uyghurs. They've had for a long time, but they also feel that's not their problem. So I don't see the pan-Turkic dimension being taking a serious role in Central Asian attitudes towards the mass internment. The second dimension is a little more of a wild card. I think it's weak right now, but could be more powerful in the future, and that's the religious dimension. Among those Central Asians who have become more religious in recent years, as they begin to understand the details of what's happening to the Uyghurs and Kazakhs and Kyrgyz inside China, they will understand that part of what's happening is an erasure not only of their identity, but also of the Islamic religion entirely. And I think that could influence things going forward, depending on the degree to which political Islam becomes a factor in Central Asia. The strongest influence is the nationalist dimension. So there are a significant number of Kazakhs in these mass internment camps, and they've been some of the most vocal people about them because a lot of them have been able to get out. A lot of them are dual citizens of both Kazakhstan and China. On that basis, they were able to get out of the camps, and they went to Kazakhstan, and much to the chagrin of the Kazakh government, they started talking about what's happening in China. And they've been fairly active in that regard. And also there's been some Kyrgyz that have been identified as being in these camps. It could also, I think down the road, turn out that we'll find out about Uzbeks in these camps, and that could also trigger some more attention to this issue in the Central Asian states. The final dimension is the idea of first they came for the Uyghurs. And for the Central Asian states, I think people inside of them see China as a major part of their future. And if they feel this is the way they're treating the Uyghurs, they're going to be worried about what happens next. I want to mention that why this matters in terms of Central Asian politics. I think the domestic political ramifications could be significant, but only in certain places. So first of all, none of the states and none of the governments want to bring up this issue. They're already very much entangled with China economically. They don't want to upset that apple cart. But they may have to begin to address it if they are forced to by their populations. So that brings up the question of where does that matter? I would argue right now in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, that doesn't matter very much. The political systems are closed, and there's not any evidence that there's Tajiks, Uzbeks, or Turkmen in the camps right now. However, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, I would argue it can matter quite a bit. And just to go first to Kyrgyzstan, we've already seen some protests and at least one civic organization organized around this question of China's mass internment of ethnic Kyrgyz. And this has been supported by one of the most aggressive nationalist groups in the country, Kyrgyzstan. And I could very much see in a country like Kyrgyzstan, which has very real elections and a competitive political system, this becoming a wedge issue in upcoming elections. Different people using it against incumbent politicians. Why have you said nothing about this? And it also dovetails with a lot of a rising anti-Chinese sentiment in Kyrgyzstan with regards to infrastructure projects that a lot of Kyrgyz feel have been very corrupt and have failed, most notably an electricity station, I think it is, in Bishkek this past winter that the Chinese built ended up not providing electricity for a significant amount of time, and that really turned things in Kyrgyzstan. However, Kazakhstan is really the place that I think is most important because, as I mentioned, Kazakhs, ethnic Kazakhs from China have been some of the most vocal about this situation. At least it's been the place where we've seen the most eyewitnesses come from, who've actually been in these camps, both teachers and internees. And there's a very strong civic organization that was established in Kazakhstan, I think about a year ago, called Atajurt. And this organization has been very successful in spreading information about the situation. In the last 2 weeks, we've seen a sudden turn in the situation of Atajurt. First, we saw a letter that emerged from several Kazakh intellectuals who are known for their nationalist credibility, write a very strange letter and publish a very strange letter criticizing Atajurt. For people who study Kazakhstan politics, you might see that as a red flag, something's going to happen next, and something did. The government raided the Atajurt offices and they arrested its leader, Serjan Dilash. And he's now been detained, I think, for 18 days so far. So this is an extremely touchy subject for Kazakhstan also because the ethnic Kazakhs from China are part of a larger group in Kazakhstan known as the Orolman that the first president of Kazakhstan, I can say that now, Nursultan Nazarbayev, invited the Orolman as a part of the nation-building project. And so this movement is very strong among these people, and it's a very touchy subject for the government to attack these people. Now, I would argue the big question now is after last week. I actually gave a very similar talk to this last Monday before Tuesday morning when Nursultan Nazarbayev resigned. The question is, what role will anti-Chinese attitudes in Kazakhstan play in a succession of the presidency in Kazakhstan? And I would argue that is certainly possible. I think it's unlikely in the near term. I think that President Tokayev is only a placeholder. The question is when there is an election meant to legitimize a real successor, a long-term successor. The question is, will that be a very competitive election, one, and two, if not a competitive election, create a power struggle? And in that case, I think this issue of China, ethnic Kazakhs being interned, could play a very big role in determining who comes out on top of that kind of succession struggle. So that's just some of the ideas I've been thinking about in terms of this, and I'll hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you for a very comprehensive and well-informed report. Our next speaker is Ilshat, who is a graduate of the Dalian Technical University in China and spent 15 years at the CACI Teachers Training College in Xinjiang, and we're very proud to have you here and your role as president of the Uyghur Association of America. Sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so honored to share this stage with distinguished and experts, scholars. Thank you all, and give me this chance. And I am a victim of this China's atrocity, crackdown on the Uyghurs. And this, I don't want back to the history too long, but for recent, I would say that 2009, 5th of July is a watershed, starting from the Chinese totally changed their policy. Before that, their strategy was to assimilate Uyghur or all other Turkish minorities, with the Chinese saying, 非我族类，其心必异. If you are not my group, you are my enemy. This is the Chinese traditional saying. So that's the long-term strategy. But after 2009, in 2010, one of the Chinese military academic, his name is Dai Xu, and he gave a speech publicly in a military college. And he said, well, in that speech, if America have a big conflict with us, China, America can in one night mobilize 40,000 to 50,000 Uyghur to be fight alongside U.S. with China. And this public speech, it was all over the website. This looking whole Uyghur nation as an enemy of the China started, and then comes the Tsinghua University, Huangang, Beida University, Marong's second generation ethnic policy. In this second generation ethnic policy, Marong and Huangang and another one guy, his name is Hu Lianhe, and they emphasize abolish all of the ethnic or nationality, even abolish the autonomous region, the title, make Xinjiang 3 parts, is Turkestan we call, and then make the Chinese language as the national language, and eliminate all the so-called minority privilege policy. Then this intensified, and after the 2014, the policy, since the Xi Jinping on the stage become the president, this intensified, and they almost like had a war on Uyghur. And with that, I categorize this like this few. They are trying to first destroy our identity, culture, and they, the Chinese government labeled Uyghur as 2 categories. One is can transform. Second category is unable to transform. So that can be transformed, they will use all their means to transform them to be Chinese, no more Uyghur. And the second part, they deem cannot be transformed. They are using physical destruction or final solution, something like that. And with that, first they started labor transferring. Started from 2005 officially. Before that, they did some small scale, but starting 2005, it's mass transferring so-called unemployed Uyghur young girls and young boys to in proper China proper, to give them employment, cut off from all Uyghur community and will cut off from their cultural base. So now, until now, this is a continuing. Yesterday, I saw a 2018 China census in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. In that, 2017, Uyghur population from the Chinese census is 11 million. And at least now, 1 to 2 million Uyghur already as the labor transfer working in China proper and in some labor-intense factories, assembly line. This is the first category. Second one, they use the Xinjiang ban. From the Uyghur or other Turkish minority graduate from elementary school, and they will go to China in secondary school and high school. And this is the second step. And this student is already in the number, more than million. And the Chinese created some, intentionally created some encouraging this student after graduate leaving, not back home, living inside China. Giving them some easy job, giving them some housing. So also this group was cut off from the cultural base, from the community, and they are in the high school, secondary school, in university, totally using the Chinese. This is the second. Then, starting from 2017, re-education camp. This is for the leftover Uyghurs. So re-education camp, they call it vocational training center, and recently added another name, boarding school. Whatever they are changing name, we know it's a concentration camp, very simply put it. Because the people is indefinite inside, and I remember one is the Chinese CCTV's clip about one journalist asking one student, when you will get out from here? She couldn't answer that. I need to learn Chinese, and I will learn skills, and then I will learn the laws, and I will continue to improve my skills, because it is indefinite. So this is already with the Xinjiang, Professor Andrea Zing's, their assessment, and also U.S. State Department. At least 800,000, more than 2 million Uyghur, Kazakh, all is in this concentration camp.
Mr. Kakbori, can I ask you now to turn your attention to our main question, which is the impact of these developments on the rest of Central Asia and the response of Central Asia to these developments.
And it is from the Uyghur side, or in the eastern Xinjiang side, the all Turkish minority is facing this cultural cleansing, or what I use. And this will have scared the Central Asia. And Kazakhstan becomes the front line of this, exposing the Chinese atrocity. That's why just now Professor Shanrob mentioned Atayurt and its leader was Serikjan Bilash was arrested and detained. And Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan actually is a front line. And Kyrgyzstan having some sporadic demonstration. And China was pushing in this recent change. In the beginning, I believe Kazakhstan government pretending they didn't say it, and probably give some encouragement, because as we said just now, a lot of Kazakh also from Kazakhstan came from our side. So this sentiment as a nationality, same ethnic group, made Kazakhstan government loosen a little bit their control. So the Atayurt and the Kazakh escaped from the concentration camp, came to Kazakhstan, especially in the Almaty, gives so many testimonies. The first testimony given by Umar, he is from there and he is a Kazakh. And also Sayragul Saud, she was a teacher over there. So this made China very, very uncomfortable. And they used their power to influence Kazakhstan. I don't know if Nazarbayev's resign is related to this, but from what I know is now current the placeholder. He is studied in he was stayed in China for a while, so probably China will have more impact or more efficient hand over there to silence the Kazakh. So this atrocity, exposure of this atrocity will be silenced for a while, or even if it's not completely can silence them, but still will have some impact on this whole. And Kyrgyzstan is also, even though they have some election and democracy, but still they are not having big impact on this. And China's Belt One Road is still expanding over there. They are having big influence. In current situation, only if the Russians stand up against China, if they feel it is also threat to Russia's interest, probably the Central Asia and some country can stand up against this. If not, we need U.S. to step in on that region to boost their government's bravery. So gives them some incentive or some encouragement to stand up. If not, I'm not that much hopeful.
Thank you very much, sir. I greatly appreciate it. Your direct sources are very valuable these days, and I hope we keep hearing from them. We now turn to Alim Saitov, who is the service director of the Uyghur service at Radio Free Asia, and he was, prior to that, director of the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Alim.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to speak here, and I became the director of Uyghur service actually not very long ago, just 2 years ago. It's 6 months after Chen Quanguo, the current party secretary of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, was transferred from Tibet to the Uyghur region in August 2016. Prior to that, you may know that Chen Quanguo was a party secretary of Tibet for 5 years, and he was sent there to basically pacify the restless Tibetan people, because there were a number of, or waves of Tibetan self-immolations. And after Chen Quanguo was dispatched to the Uyghur region as the party secretary, he had obviously initiated a number of drastic policies that we are witnessing. And as mandate of Radio Free Asia, Uyghur service, our job is to cover the human rights violations and the political situation in the Uyghur region. So we have closely followed and consistently covered and the new policies. And he had introduced a chain of policies highly requested that we have covered. For example, first, he started with like the grid-style control system. Every 500 meters, kind of like 500 yards here, police station, what they call a convenience police station. Then they man 10, 20, sometimes up to 30 Chinese fully armed soldiers with assistant police, SWAT teams sometimes to check the Uyghurs, pretty much Uyghurs and other Turkic groups, including Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz IDs. If they have a special ID, if you swipe, if the person is blacklisted or for whatever reason, it bips. As soon as it bips, the police arrest, search, check, and send to the camps. Then after that, confiscate the passports of all Uyghurs, including Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, so international travel became impossible. Then, when we started calling different places, interviewing Chinese officials, police, including residents in different regions, then we began to realize people began to disappear. And the reason is were very arbitrary, because they had, attend some kind of religious sermon like 10, 15 years ago. They prayed like a few times a day, or they attended some religious event, or just some wedding that somebody started a little religious preaching. It's not just a beard and scarves. It's more than that. For little things like that that happened 5, 10, or even a decade ago, a lot of these people picked up. So when we did all the reporting, when we contacted all the officials, our initial guess was this was kind of like a temporary measure there, because this happened many, many times since 1949. Every time something big happens, if in Beijing they have the 2 sessions congresses, they usually pick up for whatever preventive measures, like they rounded up some Chinese activists in Beijing, let them keep low profile, things like that. But after Chen Quanguo came, this wasn't like a short-term measure. This became very well known after the last, the previous 2 congresses in early 2018. Many Uyghurs at the time hoped that, I think of Kazakhs, all the other groups, that this was going to be a temporary measure after Xi Jinping was declared basically lifetime president. The things would ease up, and a lot of these people would be released. But that hasn't happened. And then Sheikh Zakir, who is a Uyghur himself, but is a chairman of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and they call it re-election, election kind of like here, but really not like here. It's basically selection by the Chinese government. So during his speech in early 2018, when he was re-elected as a chairman of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, he stated that current policy would be put in place for the next 5 years. So if you count from early 2017, it's only 2 years. For another 3 years, and this will go on. And when you look at the speech of Kazakh during just a couple of weeks in Beijing, during this 2 sessions, he basically justified everything and calling for even more hardline measures. And today, just Wang Yang, China's People's Congress chairman, who visited the Uyghur region from the 20th to 25th March, just until yesterday, he said we're gonna perfect the stability maintenance measure in Xinjiang, in spite of, according to the State Department, of course, anywhere from 800 to 2 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, other ethnic Turkic and Muslim minorities in these camps. The government continues to call for strengthening these hardline measures. And it's not letting up anything. And for the Uyghurs, in our coverage, the start was like a lot of Uyghurs in Egypt studying. Suddenly their parents were held hostage. We did a lot of these interviews. A lot of them involuntarily had no choice because otherwise their parents would be detained or whatnot, so they had to return. Some lucky few were able to flee to Turkey, but some others were detained by the Egyptian authorities and deport them back to China. So for the Uyghur community overseas, in the past, of course, if you flee into like in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, some few Uyghurs, I think after mass protest in 1997, was it? Yeah, 7. Yeah, Ulja massacre, that was called at the time. Then the Central Asian countries actually helped China and deport these Uyghurs back. And in the case of Egypt, we had anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 Uyghur students were studying there. They were forced to return. In addition to that, the Egyptian government assists the Chinese government in detaining and in deporting these Uyghurs back. So for the Uyghurs, suddenly they were like, wow, they thought they fled China into another country and technically they are safe. But China's long arm is reaching them into another country. And another country is supporting Chinese government unjustifiably deporting the Uyghurs back to China. So this became a very big shock. In addition to that, I think we reported mostly Uyghur cases and some Kazakh, Kyrgyz cases as well. Once they return from overseas after China will become the party secretary, as long as they do not have a foreign passport, American, European, whatever passport, as soon as they land in China, any airport, they disappear for good. All the Uyghurs who return from Egypt, their whereabouts basically unknown. And some Uyghurs return from Turkey, they're detained, they're gone. Some Uyghurs return from Malaysia, from Europe, they detained. Some Uyghurs return from US, for example. We have several examples. They all basically disappeared in this big black hole. And the Chinese government obviously doesn't answer any questions regarding that. So when we did all the reporting initially, we thought Chinese government just do some preventive detention of the Uyghurs, that what China describes as people who are under the influence of extremism. But then we were able to confirm the detention of high-level Uyghur intellectuals, artists, singers, writers, historians, and even basically sportsmen. Like a couple of soccer stars, popular soccer stars, young ones, got detained by the Chinese authorities. One of them, I believe, was recently released. So when you see the targeting, it's all level. It's not just the so-called few farmers who were listened to some religious sermon, got influenced by some extremist idea, but targeting basically pretty much all. In addition to that, it's the first time, I believe, they're targeting Kazakhs, they're targeting Kyrgyz, Uzbeks as well. All the original indigenous population there who are Turkic and the Muslim. So that's why the connection with Kazakhstan, with Kyrgyzstan, not so much with Uzbekistan, and others happening. And for the Kazakhs, they were also very shocked because in the Kazakhs in the Uyghur region, obviously, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyz, initially they thought Soviet Union disintegrated, Kazakhstan became independent, Kyrgyzstan, all the Stans became independent, so that Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Tatar all lived with the Uyghurs for hundreds of years. They suddenly felt the belonging. They no longer belong to what Uyghurs call, of course, East Turkestan, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but for them is they have their own country. So a lot of them immigrate to Central Asian countries, and they felt the issue of the Uyghurs, the repression, is only Uyghur problem, nothing much to do with them. But now, when the Chinese government suddenly targeted them, detained them, tens of thousands of them, it's unclear how many Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Tatar, Tajiks have been detained. At RFA, we were able to basically confirm that large numbers of Kazakhs detained, large number of Kyrgyz detained, and the Kazakh, Kyrgyz intellectuals have been detained by the Chinese authorities, and those Kazakhs, Kyrgyz who returned from Kazakhstan with a Kazakh, Kyrgyz green card, basically, resident card, but with a Chinese passport, all of them got detained. Even those Kazakh, Kyrgyz citizens, formerly from the Uyghur regime, moved into those countries, immigrated and became. Upon their return, they were also detained by the authorities for a month. Then later, under the pressure possibly from the Kazakh governments stating either you charge them or return our citizens, then some of them were returned. We interviewed, for example, several Uyghur Kazakh citizens of Kazakhstan. One is mentioned by Sean and Ilshat, Ali, for example. He's half Uyghur, half Kazakh. He was just doing he just paid a visit to his own parents, and he got detained by the Chinese authorities, even though he was a Kazakh citizen. And we also have another, Gulbahar Jalilova, in addition to Sayragul and other Kazakh citizens. This is a Uyghur lady who was born in Kazakhstan, who had no relatives in the Uyghur region. This is practically a foreign citizen. She just did like a business, little trade. She goes to Ulja, she goes to Urumqi, do a little buying and selling. Then when she went to Urumqi, she was detained by the Chinese authorities. She was locked up for like more than a year even. And the Chinese government forced her to change her name. Because the Uyghurs, like Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, others in Central Asia, they all use the Russian suffix like Jalilova. Usually it's Jalil in the Uyghur language. So Jalilova, Gulbahar Jalilova. The Chinese government changed her name, issued her Chinese ID card in the detention facility. And she, because she was born in Kazakhstan, she couldn't speak a single word of Chinese. Then she was forced to learn the red songs, because every morning what they do is they chant the flag raising ceremony, they have to sing in Chinese, praise Xi Jinping, praise Chinese Communist Party for all the wonderful things that's happening in the camps. So she couldn't. Because she couldn't, she was abused verbally, physically. At the end of the day, then because she happens to be a foreign citizen, then the Chinese government allowed her to leave the country. And that's why she was able to come up and speak about her own experience. So on the one hand, the Chinese government in its media tried to portray this is a very benevolent, excellent thing China is doing, helping the people who are influenced under extremism and whatnot. Giving them free food, free boarding, free this, free that, and giving them the technical training. But we have a number of high-level Uyghur intellectuals, people there, and UHRP, Uyghur Human Rights Project, just came up with a report, updated this report yesterday. They confirmed at least 386, I believe, high-level Uyghur officials with PhDs, doctors, professors. And the two examples I'd like to cite.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, can you return to the main theme?
Yeah.
The impact of this in Central Asia and the response of Central Asians to these developments.
Thank you. And we have, there were a lot of exchanges, of course, between the Uyghurs, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, all the people of Central Asia. It's a historic, because historically Uyghurs believe similar people, language-wise. If somebody is Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Tatar, we can practically understand one another without much of a problem. So although the land is divided, belongs to different countries, there were a lot of cultural, exchange, mutual, in a way, support. But now, although it used to be seen as an isolated issue, inside of China, now there is a spillover effect affecting the Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and so as Sean said, with the resignation of Nursultan Nazarbayev, and we'll yet to see what happens, what kind of response new Kazakh leadership will, have with regard to this, and the Kyrgyz government and other governments in the region. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to hear from James Clad, who is at the American Foreign Policy Council with all of us. He is a senior fellow on Asian affairs there and director of the Asian Security Program.
Right. Thank you.
I should say, he was also Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Asia-Pacific region, and he was also a professor at Georgetown and also at the NDU, National Defense University.
And my favorite part isn't mentioned. I was a foreign correspondent with the Far Eastern Economic Review for a number of years, which is still lamented, its absence,
Yes.
destroyed by Dow Jones, which bought it and then killed it. At the beginning of this century, got into a Land Rover, or Chinese approximation thereof, and drove from Kasha to Gilgit on the Karakoram Highway. This date of the trip was, well, we got back on the 8th of September 2001. Proximity, of course, to the date, the infamous date. So I think we're one of the last set of people who went across on the road in conditions of comparative liberty. Watching what the Chinese were doing in Xinjiang, and I'd been a foreign correspondent, I'd seen places where people were being oppressed very visibly and not so visibly, but it really struck with me how much of a mismatch there was between the Chinese explanation of what kind of place they were running, its history, its past, its rationale, and what was seen to be believed by people there. And since then, although my work brought me into doing kind of big macro Sino-American issues, I worked for Secretary Robert Gates, and I was tasked to look at ways in which we could begin a belated dialogue after all of the excessive interest in the counterterrorism war after 9/11. We could begin a process of finding out multilaterally what we could do to constrain our Chinese friends in the Western Pacific. So we began to do a series of strategic dialogues, that was the word, in which you didn't really have to mention the topic on the agenda because it was, the Southeast Asians were wonderful. We'd say, what's going on? And they'd say, you mean with China? We'd say, well, anywhere. But of course it was the strategic environment, it was changing. And I'm proud to say that we anticipated the so-called pivot of the following Obama administration by beginning belatedly to talk in terms that they wanted us to talk in, strategic and also indirect and not talking very much. In those meetings, what struck me, particularly since I'd worked in various guises in Southeast Asia with majority Muslim countries, with the Indonesians, with the people in Brunei, with the Malaysians, there was a real kind of over the coffee cups during the recesses, during the periods where we weren't talking to a formal agenda. The question of the treatment of the Ummah, the community of believers in China, would come up as a personal thing. And then what we saw developing along the way and in the intervening years was this question of how much can be said in a way about an interest, an issue, which is of profound sensitivity to the Chinese, right? Profound sensitivity. It's a sensitivity which reflects insecurity of their position. They attribute to Uyghurs a great deal of, malign intent, which is very difficult to suss out. They are unsure of themselves. One of the things I did in the intervening time was work with the energy worlds and was watching the linkages in Central Asia with the Turkmens in particular, but also Kazakhs and Uzbeks, and in Xinjiang with natural gas deposits. And all of this was going on. And you could find all kinds of arguments within the Chinese state for people who felt that somehow the Uyghurs were a threat, right? That they disagreeably refused to be assimilated. They weren't on on they weren't doing the type of things the Chinese expected them to do. And what we've seen along the way, and I was doing a bit of reading for this event before I came this morning, is that there's incrementally periods of times where the same thing is in play, but the scale is huge. The late 1990s riots, but not of the scale that happened in 2009. And the attitude, well, here we're getting to the point that Fred wants me to touch on, the attitude nearby in proximate countries is to look anywhere but the problem itself. Certainly not in any formal way to raise it with the Chinese authorities. To, in a sense, kind of wish it would go away, but it isn't going to go away because beneath the level of state-to-state discourse, the language of diplomacy, communiques, and the rest of it, is a great deal of deep, deep anger about the Chinese in a way that affects, for example, the Vietnamese relationship with China, where if you travel in any fishing village in Vietnam, you'll hear some very strident opinions, very xenophobic opinion, and real issues in that regard are felt in Central Asia. But what struck me also, when I had time living in Indonesia and Malaysia in the first, 1980s and 90s, was the lack of the type of effort that the Saudis were putting into castigating the Chinese because of the treatment of Muslim believers. Unlike that, you could begin to see that dissipate in the 90s, you could see it in the 2000s, particularly after 9/11, particularly after we went along with the Chinese request to label ETIM and the other groups as terrorist organizations based on very paucity of information. Nobody's ever really worked out the convincing argument that would have us labeling this group as terrorists, except for claimed primarily by the Chinese linkages with Osama bin Laden. So there's a great deal of, I think, missed opportunity and rather kind of a giveaway attitude to the Chinese when we went along in early 2002, I think it was, with the labeling of ETIM and TIP as part and parcel of the international jihadi terrorist group, which is crazy. So it was a win for China, and of course they're going to retain that, and they dig in their heels, and they will not budge. What is our possibilities of dealing with the current outrage which is going on in Xinjiang? Again, I said it's cumulative, it's ebb and flow, but each time the scale seems bigger and bigger. Bigger authoritarian response, bigger Orwellian response, bigger anger, bigger mass impact. And here the question is, how do you feed this into the Sino-American agenda, which is already huge, in a way that is productive? Because the worst thing to do is to embrace a downtrodden people for the purposes of virtue, feeling good about ourselves, where the effect for those people on the ground can be very, very discouraging. So the thought that I'd like to have you think about, and possibly in question time, which is, how can we realistically, at a time like this where, China policy is made on the hoof, I mean, let's be clear about it, it's a very, very strange period of time. There's no ordering, no prioritization of issues that we have with the Chinese that I can work out. Things are done on the fly. Things are now seen for their effect on a trade agenda, which is not the way it used to be. We are getting back to a situation where we are talking national security to the Chinese and doing things in the Western Pacific, which the last administration was too cautious about doing. It's important that we are very clear with our Chinese friends in those situations. But what can be done for the Uyghur situation to ameliorate and abate the worst excesses? What can be done in a way that isn't going to boomerang on their advocacy and be seen as one more talking point of the United States, which is in a confrontational mood with China? That's the question I want to leave with you, because I'm very anxious to hear people speak. I hope that's okay, Fred.
Thank you very much for all of our excellent speakers. I would like to usurp two questions, the agenda with two questions. First, directed to Sean Roberts, and that is, the word information has not been raised here. What information on all this exists in Central Asian countries?
So I think again, Central Asia as a whole is, it's difficult to talk about Central Asia as a whole because each country has different access to information. In a place like Turkmenistan, it's very likely people have very little information about this. There has been some Russian coverage, but not much. I haven't seen any coverage by like the central TV stations in Russia. I've only seen some website coverage by Russian journalists who've gone to the region. And in Kazakhstan, I think because of this Atatürk group, I think that there is a fair amount of information. Certainly, the Kazakh government's been careful, but one of the things that recently the Chinese government did is they set up a press tour of the region and of these re-education camps where they had Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek journalists. And I have to say the official Kazakh Newswire had a very good story about it. It had no analysis, but they covered everything extremely factually, which I was surprised at. They said, well, we heard this from this person, but there was a Chinese official next to them. So they were sending the message without saying, we don't believe this show. They were putting all the information there for people to understand. So I think that's probably a low level of information right now in the region, but my guess is that it's going to increase. I think at a place like Tajikistan, there might not be much access. There's certainly access in Kyrgyzstan if people want to find the information.
Thank you very much. My second question I'd like to direct to two members of our group here, Svante Cornell and Ayrat Abdulin, if I may. Mr. Abdulin is Tatar, and maybe you could comment on these. Is this known in Tatarstan, and what kind of response are Tatars making to all these developments? And then the same I want to ask of Svante Cornell in Turkey. Sir.
Unfortunately, I'm not authorized to comment this issue. I'm sorry.
Understood, yes. He's at the Russian embassy.
Well, on the Turkish front, I think this is very well covered, and we've even seen attacks by nationalist elements in Turkey on the street that people who happen to look Chinese that were not necessarily Chinese in several cases, so that the Chinese Foreign Ministry has travel advisories to Turkey for this. I would say even further that this has put a kind of, or put it this way, for a while there was a growing relationship between China and Turkey on the strategic front. As we know, President Erdogan has in the past made comments about what's happening in Xinjiang being tantamount to cultural genocide, if I'm not mistaken, but that was maybe 10 years ago. Then for a while, as his relationship with the West got worse, he didn't say much about this issue. And that allowed the Chinese relationship to get closer, and even after the attempted coup in 2016, the Chinese were the first to come in, sent the deputy foreign minister, to shore up support for Erdogan, promise money and stuff like that. But because the Turkish government is no longer solely the domain of Mr. Erdogan, but because in the past 4 years he's been forced into a, should we call it, a marriage of convenience with the nationalist forces in the military and the bureaucracy, he can no longer ignore this issue the way he probably would have liked to. I don't know if he would have liked to, but even if he would have liked to, he can't. Because this is very much a motivating factor for the nationalist forces in Turkey, not only the MHP, which is his governing coalition partner, but also the very strong forces in the bureaucracy and especially in the military who belong to a Turkish idea, have a Turkish nationalist view of the world. So I think this poses a serious strategic challenge for the Turkish-Chinese relationship, much more so than in any other country.
Could you add a word on Azerbaijan?
I don't frankly know if this has any bearing on Azerbaijan. I haven't followed that. Maybe somebody else.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I do know that there was, I saw a story probably several months ago of one Tatar in Kazan who had a one-person protest on this issue. So obviously there's some information in Tatarstan about what's happening.
Good. The floor is open. Yes.
So a quick
Go ahead.
question, throwing it around on the other side.
Introduce yourself. There's
Gavin
a mic coming, even though you don't need it.
I don't. Gavin Hill from U.S. Agency for International Development. I work in the Asia Bureau. I'm interested in the other sort of side of that question, which is the extent to which China is trying to control the message about what's going on. I've heard, both in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, from people who are not affiliated with the government, oh, you know, there's only 5,000 people in the camp. And they said it with, you know, thinking that it was a credible number, which suggests to me that there's some attempt by the Chinese to control messaging on this, whether it's in social media or whether it's through news agencies. So I'd like to ask whether you've noticed that on their side, their public diplomacy.
Quick response?
Okay. On their side, of course, the Chinese government is using their own spin to try to convince possibly the whole world to believe their own stories. But in our own reporting, we were able to, for example, one aspect that is lacking by the international community, media especially in reporting, is a transfer of Uyghur, possibly Kazakh and Kyrgyz detainees from the Uyghur region to other parts of China. We have confirmed that initially detainees were transferred to Heilongjiang.
Yes.
Then to
Excuse
either
me,
Mongolia.
may I interrupt you? The
Yes.
subject, the question is
Yes.
the Chinese information policy directed towards Central Asia on events in Xinjiang.
Okay, maybe somebody else should answer. Thank you.
I can just say that there is a concerted effort generally, and as I mentioned, they have this kind of show tour where they explicitly invited kind of the local Belt and Road partners, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan journalists. And as I mentioned, the Kazakh report basically told what the Chinese government told them, but also provided the information for a critical reader to doubt that. But I think that, this also goes to something that Dr. Clad said about the general feeling in Central Asia that they want to ignore this. They want to hope this isn't true, And I think a lot of people, I've talked to some Central Asians about this as well. They're skeptical of it because I think for a lot of reasons they don't want this to be true.
There's also the question of being seen as being duped by the Americans. In Southeast Asia, Chinese information says, well, if you parrot these figures, it just shows you that you're singing a song that's approved by Uncle Sam, and that is something that affects people's judgment.
Yes, sir. Yes,
To
please.
that, like in US, the China have a lot of Confucian institution. They are doing the China's propaganda, and also having Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, they have the Confucianists, and also some outlet of their China's news organizations.
Can you indicate, do we have concrete evidence of what the Confucian Institutes are doing in this issue?
Yes, they are mobilizing their students to say and what they heard from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, that some Kazakhs in the upper yurts, they are exaggerating, blah, blah. Yeah, they are mobilizing their students in Confucian institution to say China's propaganda.
This happens in Australia, for example, and there's also the feeling that if you're too strong on this issue, you are impugning the character of the Han Chinese people. So the whole thing has become conflated with attitudes to China and China's rise, and it's seen as a way to deflate the Chinese and to restrain it from its proper place.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Alex Sanchez, Chain Defense. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the situation in the ground in the border between Kazakhstan and China, like the border crossings. You have Kyrgyz and Kyrgyzstan, back here in Tachin. So what is the situation on the ground in these border crossings? Is it still business as usual? Are there like fewer Kazakhstani citizens trying to go into China after what you have just explained that's going on? Or is still, or are there more Uyghurs trying to cross the border crossings to go into Kazakhstan? Or has that just stopped completely? Thank you.
If my understanding is correct, you are asking if we can cross the border to Kazakhstan, right? Freely.
What's the situation right now?
The situation is the border was controlled very strictly, so we were unable to cross the border with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. That's why some Uyghur in the few years back came from Southeast Asia and Malaysia, Laos, because the border control was very strict. It's unable to anyone to cross the border.
Yes, please.
If I may add, a lot of Uyghur businessmen in both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, because they cannot return, they have cross-border businesses. If they return, they know they'll be detained, and they are passports, visas, not just there. We also introduced some Uyghur business people in Moscow actually who are doing business. Because if they return, they don't know what's awaiting them, they will be disappear. So, and they cannot go to the Chinese embassies or consulates to extend their passports, because some of them did in Turkey, for example. We also report on that. Then the Chinese government took the passports away. Instead of issuing a new passport or extended passport, they gave them the one-way travel document, just the one entry to China, that's it. So some of them used that return, then disappeared. Some of them, they did not. So they are becoming stateless, a lot of those Uyghurs. In Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, in a lot of countries, in Turkey as well. Because what can they do? So that's what's happening, but there is no like Uyghurs going back and forth like normally. That's not happening.
Does anyone know what's happened to the Uyghur theater in Bishkek? Does it still exist, and is it?
Or Almaty.
Or Almaty?
Almaty, I think they actually have a big building.
Yeah.
Do you know if it still exists?
I think it's still there.
Still there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still there.
But this isn't on their agenda.
But God knows how long it's going to stay there.
I mean, I can just mention just quickly, I mean, one thing is the Kazakh government is not, is very accommodating to its own Uyghur citizens. They're not really that discriminated against in the context of Kazakhstan. The only thing they want to make sure they don't do is get into political activism against China. So that's if it's theater, that's okay, but
Yes. We got a question.
Okay. Now, mainly question for our Uyghur friends.
Could you introduce
There were there were reports that China used extensive tools in technology, especially in artificial intelligence in the Uyghur region, in monitoring, not only physical monitoring through the cameras, but also social media. And it was apparently a big success. And how they're marketing the same technology for crowd control or whatever control in other places, including Central Asia. And there's a big debate in America when the tech companies are asked not to cooperate with the Pentagon. The same companies are very much cooperating with Chinese government. So my question is if this information about using technology is accurate, and if yes, in what extent it has a real impact on the ground.
I participated in writing a report that was published by the Congressional Commission on Security and Economic Affairs with China on advanced defense weapons research. AI is an integrated factor in many of the things they're doing, whether it's hypersonic platforms or whatever the hell it is. So the capacity is there. Now the application of it, I'm not following it terribly closely. But I do think that it's slightly more nuanced than you're suggesting, which is the American tech firms are holding back from helping the Defense Department here, but are happy to help the Chinese. I think it's a question of what they're able to do in the business sphere and continue to have a business presence. That's not justification for being involved with something like that. It's just a rational explanation.
Yes, please. Down here.
Thank you. I'm Harley Balzer from Georgetown University. And I guess I'd like to get back to the impact in Central Asia. There are three other major concerns about China. One is using Belt and Road as a way to essentially reduce China's own Great Wall of Debt by making war loans in Central Asia and other countries in the Belt and Road program. The second, of course, is the Chinese migrants that come along with Belt and Road. And the third, which I've seen in the Russian Far East, and it might also be happening in Central Asia, which is that as the Chinese shut down polluting factories, they're moving them. And while in Moscow, the government doesn't seem to object to this, local scholars and environmentalists have been writing about it a lot. I'm wondering if those three issues can be tied in at all with the broader concern about Uyghurs.
Thank you very much. The floor is open to anyone to respond.
I'll jump in on that. I mean, I think very much those issues dovetail with what's happening in the Uyghur region of China. So I think in many ways, those issues are going to be more visceral for people in Central Asia. But I think this could just, what's happening in the Uyghur region could add, flame to that fire quite easily, and particularly in Kyrgyzstan. I mean, I was at a conference on Central Asia in November, and there were a lot of Kyrgyz scholars talking about corruption in the Belt and Road. A lot of people doing monitoring of what's happening, a lot of suspicion. And I asked a lot of these people about the situation of this mass internment camps in Xinjiang, and they were like, oh, well, yeah, that's over there. But I could see if they start to feel any kind of association with that, even if it's this issue that I mentioned of, this could be our future, if China essentially becomes the main player in the region. I think that this could play a role along with all these other things you're talking about.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Dr. Clad, maybe you can speak to this. You started earlier to talk about the Ummah and the response or the lack of response to what was going on with the Uyghurs. Now I understand that we have not heard too much from Pakistan and some other countries because of economic interests, perhaps with China. But I would like people to explore with us what Muslim countries have taken a public stand, and have they been heard, and what's going on in Saudi Arabia?
There's very little by way of public declaratory comment, criticism, ostracism, and all the rest of it. That's not to say that people aren't speaking their minds. It's often seen that the Saudis are completely hand in glove with the Chinese, and they are in a number of respects: strategic oil reserves, purchase of defense weaponry, going right back to the 1980s. So there's a long-standing relationship. But at the same time, in matters that I'm not at liberty to completely discuss, the Saudis were very helpful in repatriating, well, not repatriating, but finding places of settlement for Uyghurs. It's very not terribly well known. And also worked to ensure that other countries, the Great Republic of Palau in the Philippines, the Western Pacific, and other areas like that, would make the effort to bring these people there with Saudi support in the background. So the Chinese are aware of that. It's just a question of the level of complaint. And at the moment, just like in 2009, Charles Hornby at the Hudson Institute said, didn't he, something like, they are exemplars of the Westphalian system, right? They treat the disturbances at the time there, whether it's Iran or Saudi Arabia, as a purely domestic matter. And that continues to be their line. And I have a feeling that there's no amount of crushing repression that will have them change their minds unless there are things which are become terribly visible in public. The real problem with the Uyghur repression is that nobody has a very clear idea about what it is and the extent to which it's, I mean, Fred was just saying, what happens to people when they go back? Is it really that comprehensive? Is it really that Orwellian? I don't know. I'm assuming it probably is. But there is a sense of being able to, for the reason I mentioned earlier, to evade criticism or evade the requirement of criticizing the Chinese because you're seen as kind of doing the Americans' bidding at a time of heightened competition.
Yes.
Just to add to the, yeah, I think that is, and just to add to that, and in part to also answer, or start an answer to your original question. What I've found is the Muslim countries that are starting to speak up are those that have some modicum of democracy. You know, just as I said in Central Asia, it's going to be possibly Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan where there's more competitive political system, there's more necessity to get legitimacy for power from the people. The other two places, or the other three places are Indonesia, Malaysia, and Turkey. So, you know, even though we don't necessarily associate all those countries with liberal democracy, they do require the support of their people. And so in Indonesia in particular, some Muslim political groups have had large protests about this and are putting pressure on the government. Malaysia also, because the last president was in part taken out of power over issues related to corruption with the Chinese. There as well, we're starting to see some interest. I know the World Uyghur Congress was even thinking about setting up relationships with Malaysian NGOs on this issue.
You had a
Yeah,
question.
I'd add, just to add to that. In the Muslim world, Turkey is the leading country standing by the Uyghurs and against the Chinese. They are very brave and stand up. Especially recently, this end of the last year, the Turkish government is pushing, even inside the OIC, Islamic organization, to condemn the Chinese. And following the Turkish leadership, the Malaysian government, and also the Indonesia, 2 months ago, I was in Malaysia, we met with the government officials, and they're very, very supportive, and they are speaking out. And of course, Turkish has been long history in the backbone of the Uyghurs. So they are speaking out, even though in some Islamic country the government wasn't speaking, but still people is speaking out. Thank you.
Yes, please. And then over here.
Crystal with the CACI Policy Center. I'd like to thank all the panelists for coming out. My question, I'm going to specify to one country, re-emphasizing what you said, Sean Roberts, earlier, that some of them are so diverse, would have a lot of different answers. So specifically going back to the fact that the Xinjiang region has said that this is probably going to go on for at least the next 3 years. I've heard a lot of information about what is going on, but I want to hear more solution. So what exactly can Kazakhstan feasibly do to stop, deter, or even assist in deterring, alongside the US and the EU, in the treatment of the Uyghurs in the region?
That's yours.
What is the question?
Questions are yours.
So what, is there anything that Kazakhstan, is there anything that Kazakhstan can feasibly do now or in the next 3 years, either by themselves or alongside the US and the EU, to deter the treatment of the Uyghurs?
Okay, let me try to answer that question. For Kazakhstan to take any action, I believe the first US needed to take action. We are talking about sanctions since from last year's April. Until today, US as a leading country in this human rights, our values for the equality, everything, and in the historically should play very aggressive rule in stopping any ethnic cleansing or genocide. So if U.S. cannot take any action, I mean concrete action, sanction some Chinese officials who are part of this atrocity, then Kazakhstan, as a Central Asian, just developing country, I don't think they can do more. In the coming 3 years, I cannot say anything. I'm not that much optimistic for the Kazakhstan. If they choose, only another one way is if Russian backs them, and the Russian feels this threat from China, from the Siberia side, and also the Russians' interest in the Central Asia was damaged by the Chinese. Then if Russians back Kazakhstan, probably another way, but I doubt Russian will back on that state. So I'm only expecting we need to mobilize here in U.S. take the first lead in taking concrete action like sanctioning some of the Chinese officials. That's the only way we can stop it.
Sir. I'm Steve Ticino, I'm a science policy.
Here comes.
My name is Steve Ticino. I am a science policy fellow at the EPA. And my question actually goes right off of what you were saying about Russia. And I'm wondering if the Russian government has their eye on this at all. Just thinking about, how in Georgia, Russians backed the Ossetians and Abkhazians just to, counter Georgia. Now, China isn't, Georgia isn't China, but in this region, if they're worried about China and Central Asia, this might be a flashpoint in the future.
Can I mention something about that?
Please, yeah. Just the one point on that is that the Soviet Union backed a Uyghur, actually not just Uyghur, it was a multi-ethnic East Turkestani republic in the 1940s. And Russia, as a result, has a lot of people who know a lot about Uyghur history, culture, language, and so on. Now, the question, of course, is more of a geopolitical one, whether the Russian government has the motivation to do anything about this. And I think it's a very good question. I could see, at the very least, Russia being interested in at least taking down China's authority a bit in Central Asia, maybe surreptitiously somehow. That might be the suggestion you can bring back. I think they certainly are in a good position for that situation. But most people who talk about geopolitics in Central Asia suggest that Russia and China have this marriage now. I'm not completely convinced of that. Or marriages have lots of disputes in there.
Let me just say one thing in that regard. It's often forgotten that the Russians, to the intense irritation of the Chinese, continue to supply and improve the defense relationship with Vietnam. And that's a place where they make a decision that they're going to go ahead, and no matter how much the Chinese scream to high heaven in the context of the South China Sea, the Russians are there. And there is a fallacy in thinking in this city that we're back at the state that you just mentioned, that it's Cold War redux, that somehow they're totally tight with one another. I think it's marriage of convenience. The Russian state is lacking a lot of capacity. I think it's biding its time.
And add to that, and still if you look at in the Chinese website, the Chinese nationalism ideology is still claiming the Siberia side of the Russian territory was part of the China in Manchu dynasty time, and also 1/3 of Kazakhstan's territory also China claims it's their land. So eventually, if Russian is always worried about that claim, and Russian eventually will try to confront China. But the current issue is Uyghur. As a Uyghur, I feel how long we can survive. If we wait for the Russian wake up and confront China, and someone else, Kazakhstan 3 years later, then it's a human disaster for Uyghurs. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming. I wish we had more time. And I want to thank particularly Sean Roberts, Cora, Alim Saitoff, and also my colleague, Brother Clad here, for their very, very interesting presentations. Now, let me say something, if I may. There's some big, we've only started this, and there's some big topics that we really didn't cover. I would say first is information. What's the level of information spreading on this, specifically country by country in Central Asia? We have some impressions, but we don't have adequate information on that. But not just the official sources locally, but access to internet sources, and which are they using that might be relevant to this. So the information matter, the failure of the West in general to have any voice directly in information in Central Asia is dramatic and affects this situation. It's a minor point, but we not even mentioned there are 250,000 Tajiks down, they're all Pamiris, down in the south of Xinjiang. They're there, and who's reporting on them? Nobody. The third sort of big neglect seems to me, personally fascinates me and appalls me, and that is the destruction of Kashgar as a Turkic city. This was predicted in our book 15 years ago by a very, very competent demographer from Ohio, from Miami University in Ohio, and he predicted it. He said that you build the railroad to Kashgar and exactly the same thing will happen that's happened in Urumqi, namely it will very quickly be turned into a Han Chinese city, and physically that has been going on. It's totally unreported in the West, not in Central Asia only, but in the West. And this is the most ancient Turkic center, period. There's nothing close to this, and it literally is being obliterated except for a couple of blocks that are being preserved as a kind of Disneyland. Now, that said, there's some very important factors regarding the Central Asian response to these events. The first, and no one mentioned it, is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Treaty. These countries signed into it. Read the treaty. They committed to turn people back. In every case, they've done so. So there's legal justification for many of these things, unfortunately, in the treaty itself, and that should be brought into any discussion of this subject. Second is and this is, everyone has said this, but it's worth saying it again in conclusion, for the Central Asians to do anything about this is to put at stake literally billions of dollars. Kazakhs particularly, but equally everyone else. Literally billions of dollars, and is it going to affect anything? That's the calculus they're making. The final point I would say, nevertheless, in spite of all this, Kazakhstan still maintains its policy about Kazakhs returning from Xinjiang to Kazakhstan, and in 2019, 2018, 2,500 Kazakhs emigrated from northern Ili and that area in northern Xinjiang to Kazakhstan, 2,500. And Kazakhstan does maintain what they call a passport office in Urumqi. They agreed with the Chinese that it can't be called a consulate, but it is issuing papers. It's still functioning. That was obviously, if the Chinese got angry about it, that's the first thing they do is close it down. So this is, I just have to agree with what Hassan said, namely that they're not in a position to do much or anything. And that they've done even anything on the edges is surprising. In other words, they are waiting for a major power, whichever major power that might be, to take a more decisive stand on this. So I suppose the conclusion one has to reach from this very well-informed discussion is that the ball's back in our court. Thank you.